This is week 199 of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Holiday Edition. I'm Belokur, reporting to you from Kyiv, and I'll be taking you through the top stories from Ukraine this week. As Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky met with EU leaders in Brussels on Thursday, one question hung in the air. Would the EU authorize a reparations loan for Ukraine of 210 billion euros backed by frozen Russian assets? The answer was, once again, no. The EU approved a smaller 90 billion euro interest-free loan that will allow Ukraine to hang on, but as in previous deliberations, member states simply could not reach consensus about using Russian assets. The question of a loan for Ukraine was urgent. Kyiv's fiscal runway is shrinking, and officials have warned Ukraine will run out of cash by spring without new financing. As Russian assets sit frozen in European banks for going on 4 years now, calls have grown to mobilize it quickly and sort out repayment clauses later. The core source of resistance to this plan is Belgium, home to Euroclear, the financial institution holding the bulk of frozen Russian assets in Europe. Belgium's prime minister has argued that his country takes on an unfair proportion of risk in initiating the seizure of the assets, and that safeguards and protocols must be hammered out beforehand. Chief among concerns is that Russia could sue and leave Euroclear to cover the cost, as well as claims that seizing the loans would be tantamount to confiscation and would undermine Euroclear as an institution. Belgium's primary demand is guarantees from Europe to protect against a billion-dollar lawsuit in the future. So in short, while Europe is willing to use Russia's money in principle, it's not willing to risk potential retaliation in practice. While Europe may believe that it has the privilege of time to deliberate, Ukraine disagrees. In the lead-up to the EU summit, Presidential Office Deputy Head Irina Mudra told the Kyiv Independent that failing to decide on the assets would be a catastrophe for every single European, casting the choice as a test of Europe's agency in the face of rising Russian aggression, not just a budget line for Ukraine. She anchored the urgency in hard numbers. Ukraine needs roughly 135 billion euros across the next calendar year to keep the state and the army functioning, with financing pressures compounding all the time as other support channels wobble. It should be noted that not all of Europe is as hesitant when it comes to this issue. Estonia's foreign minister argued in our op-ed section that using frozen assets would signal that Europe intends to shape the peace process rather than watch others do it, insisting that the aggressor should pay and that Russia is unlikely to abandon its objectives. A separate push came earlier in December from leaders of Estonia, Finland, Ireland, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Sweden, who urged EU leadership to move quickly, saying that time was of the essence. And with the exception of Ireland, you'll notice that all of those countries have an understanding of Russian aggression shaped by geographic proximity and first-hand experience. But unfortunately, these are not the countries where the majority of the assets are held. Europe perpetually teases the idea that it might turn frozen money into active spending power, only to then hesitate. In the meantime, Kyiv is putting together a hodgepodge of alternatives to stay afloat. It's not so much that one day this spring the money will simply run out and Ukraine will be broke, but rather that Ukraine's needs outpace its financing, and it's forced to constantly recalibrate amidst many moving pieces, and Russia is counting on all of it to wear Ukraine down before it itself is worn down. Frozen assets could keep Ukraine fighting another day, month, and year, which is the name of the game at this point. This show will momentarily turn into Belarus this week, because a lot happened in Belarus this week. On the one hand, Minsk came to a successful diplomatic agreement with Washington, which it then followed up by deepening its military tether to Moscow. 2 steps forward and 1 step back. In exchange for Minsk releasing a large group of political prisoners, the United States lifted sanctions on Belarusian potash fertilizer exports. Potash is one of Belarus's most significant mineral resources, with the state-owned producer Belarus ranked among the world's largest suppliers. The removal of sanctions promises some relief for the country's embattled economy, so this is a significant win for Minsk. The prisoners released in return reportedly include prominent opposition figures and former political opponents of Alexander Lukashenko, as well as a Nobel Peace Prize laureate and an Australian citizen. In total, 123 people were released, and many of them were flown to Lithuania or Ukraine afterwards, in a somewhat spontaneous setup, according to sources. American diplomats have stepped up their presence in Minsk this month as part of a broader attempt by Donald Trump's administration to bend Belarus out of its quarantine in Moscow's pod. There's even speculation that the Trump administration is trying to create something of a neutral party in Belarus, such that Lukashenko could act as a mediator between the West and Russia. Human rights have been one of the key bargaining chips used to get Minsk to engage, with the Belarusian opposition in exile celebrating long-awaited prisoner releases as a result. Critics argue, however, that the prisoner releases are less about genuine reform in Belarus and more about dictator Alexander Lukashenko's calculated diplomacy, leveraging scarce concessions to crack open Western sanctions, while the regime maintains its grip on power. Sanctions are instruments, it's leverage to make dictators do something, Belarus opposition leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya said. Lukashenko will not release people because he somehow became humane. He wants to sell people as expensively as possible. Like I said, 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Lukashenko also announced this week that Russia's new Oreshnik intermediate-range ballistic missile system has been deployed on Belarusian soil, something that's been threatened for a while, but may be more bark than bite. The Oreshnik system, touted by Russian officials as capable of carrying nuclear warheads and reaching deep into NATO territory, has only ever been deployed once against Ukraine in 2024, to little effect. Although at the max of its described capacity, it could hypothetically reach anywhere on the European continent, it's not considered groundbreaking technology, and hasn't proven itself to be terribly well-performing anyway. Rather, stationing it in Belarus represents a symbolic doubling down on the country's role as an anchor for Russian strategic forces. Even as Lukashenko seeks Western economic lifelines, his enmeshment with his more powerful neighbor keeps Belarus in isolation and under suspicion. For our 4th birthday, we set a goal to reach 25,000 members before the end of 2025. In less than a month, we reached it thanks to readers and viewers like you. To everyone who's part of our now 25K plus community, thank you for your support. And if you're not in our community and would like to join us, supporting independent journalism in Ukraine while enjoying some cool perks, there'll be a link to our membership page in the description below. Thank you also to everyone who gives directly via YouTube. Your donations go directly towards supporting shows like this. We get to end on a short and sweet note. 2 Ukrainian movies have been shortlisted for the 2026 Academy Awards. In the animated short film category, there's I Died in Your Pin, and that's directed by 25-year-old Anastasia Falyeva. The film depicts the early days of the full-scale invasion when the suburbs of Kyiv became the site of really unspeakable violence. The movie is 11 minutes long and shares the author's personal experience during that time. In the Best Documentary category, Mstislav Chernov's 2,000 Meters to Andriivka is nominated. The documentary follows a Ukrainian platoon attempting to liberate a village from Russian forces in eastern Ukraine, and takes place mainly over one stretch just over a mile long, hence the name. Chernov won the category in 2024 for 20 Days in Mariupol, and he's one of the most acclaimed Ukrainian filmmakers at home and abroad, so it'll be a really big deal here if he wins a second time. We actually interviewed Chernov about his new film, and there will be a link to that video in the description below. It's important to savor these wins in the middle of darkness. But one person who doesn't win during the Oscars is whichever of the Kyiv Independent's social media managers is working that night and has to stay up until 4 a.m. to find out the results across the time difference, and this happened to my colleague Lisa when 20 Days in Mariupol won, which means it'll probably be my turn this year, so I will keep you updated.
Hi, my name is Asami Kirajima. I'm a journalist with the Kyiv Independent covering military issues and sometimes the frontline situation. We got a question from Rudy, which said, I read about desertion and low morale within the armed forces of Ukraine, but it's somewhat from unreliable sources. I'd love to know how the freedom fighters of Ukraine are feeling after such a long and brutal fight for survival, an honest assessment of the state of the morale as they hold back the tide of tyranny. So obviously this is dependent on which unit and whether the soldiers have good commanders, good and competent commanders who actually take care of them. But in many, especially mechanized units that are large, and they're the ones often being placed on the hottest spots of the war as infantry to just hold back the relentless Russian offensives. And in those units, especially the cases of AWOL, absent without leave, and desertion are the highest. And this isn't the critical issue in the Ukrainian army now, especially at a time when there is such low manpower. I spoke to, for example, one officer from ground forces yesterday, and he was saying that some units are fighting at 30% capacity. So when many units are fighting with such low manpower, and they have no end in sight, and they're just watching, and many guys are just watching their friends, their comrades get killed or get severely wounded every single day. Of course, it affects on the morale, especially more than 4 years, nearly 4 years into the war, when because of this manpower shortage, we can't conduct rotation. Many units are fighting from one hot spot of the war to another without any breaks. The quality of new soldiers coming in, soldiers usually say that they're low quality and they're not motivated. So there's not enough people to replace those who have been fighting for nearly 4 years, since the beginning of the full-scale war or since the start of the war in 2014. So the morale is not great. In some units, very bad. If it's mechanized brigades, if it's more elite units such as Azov or Third Assault, yes, they're more motivated because they see the reason why they need to keep fighting. But unless something changes with the manpower situation and Ukraine's mobilization improves, then the morale of the army in general will just go down and down as Russia captures more cities and more towns and villages, and as they continue to advance on the front. Thank you for staying with us. My article on desertion in AWOL will come out soon, by the end of the year, and it's gonna be a deep dive into the AWOL and desertion issue, the roots of it and everything, so stay tuned.
That's all for this week. We'll be back next Sunday with more news from Ukraine. If you appreciated this video, please consider becoming a member of the Kyiv Independent community. It's truly thanks to viewers like you that we can do this work, and we're so grateful for your support. Happy holidays. I'll see you next week with a special New Year's episode.